Thank you. And before we get started, just a brief background. The Community Development Partnership leads the Lower Cape in building a diverse year-round community of people who can afford to live, work, and sorry, when people type in the chat, I'm losing myself. For people who can afford to live, work, and thrive here. To accomplish our mission, we promote, develop, and manage affordable housing, nurture the launch and growth of small businesses, and facilitate collaboration with business, nonprofit, and government partners. The 8 towns that we serve are Provincetown, Truro, Wellfleet, Eastham, Orleans, Brewster, Harwich, and Chatham. And as part of the Lower Cape Housing Institute, we provide education and technical assistance to municipalities to help towns address the housing crisis. Many of you folks who are here today. We do this by offering workshops on housing topics and coordinator relationship building across towns through our peer group meetings. In terms of the peer group meetings, CDP does host regular peer group meetings, which are an informal discussion space for municipal officials and town staff who are involved in or interested in housing production on the Lower Cape. Towns will have an opportunity to share updates on their housing initiatives and projects at these peer group meetings. In just a moment, I will make sure to put in the chat a link to where you can register for our next spring outer peer group meetings, our lower and outer peer group meetings. One of the things before we get started is that all of you will be added to our newsletter, which we send out monthly about upcoming events. And if you can keep yourself on mute, that would be really great. If you have any questions, obviously feel free to raise your hand using the chat function, or you can certainly type it in the chat as well. Now let's get started. Julie Kramer will introduce herself. And before Julie does that, I want to thank Julie and POA for their collaboration, as CDP recently submitted an application to the state for funding for the 95 Lawrence Road development in Wellfleet. And Julie and her team at POA were such a big part of that. So thank you, Julie. The floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Brad, and good morning, all. I hope you're all having a great morning despite the weather. It's very rainy here in Boston, so I'm sure you've got rain down there as well. I am, as Brad mentioned, Julie Kramer. I work for Preservation of Affordable Housing, or POA, as we're sometimes referred to. I'm going to start a slideshow, and before I do so, I require questions. Please feel free to raise your hand or put them in the chat. I've got some great folks helping me out here, and they're going to let me know when the questions come in. You know, I always feel like if you've got a question, ask it as soon as that question pops in your head, because it may be very relatable to what I'm discussing at that moment. And I don't mind going off script, how I've lived my life for many years. So please feel free to chime in if you've got any questions. I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully this is going to work for us. I think it does, although there is a slideshow, right? Are you guys seeing just the slideshow?
No, we're seeing your presenter view.
Okay, so let me try this again. Okay. How about now?
Perfect.
Perfect, great, all right. Okay, so I'll move to the next slide. So I'll give you a little bit of background on POA. I don't want to spend too much time, but POA is a nonprofit builder, manager, owner of affordable housing. We own in 11 states and the District of Columbia. We have offices in Boston, and in Chicago, where we also have a robust portfolio of properties. But really, our mission is to preserve, create, and sustain affordable housing, bringing healthy homes that support economic security and access to opportunity for all. How we do this is we preserve affordability. So POA is committed to preserving at-risk housing. And at-risk housing is a term we use to sort of describe housing that may be losing its affordability, either through a Section 8 contract, rental assistance contract, or it's housing that would be sold into the market for more of a market-focused execution. We also preserve housing that might be at risk because it's got capital needs issues, needs to be renovated or brought up to new code compliance. So an example of that on the Cape would be our housing at in Orleans, Rock Harbor Village, or Kings Landing, which is located in Brewster. So those were assets we bought, and they were existing housing, and we preserved them for the long term. We build for the future, so we do a lot of ground up construction in on the Cape and elsewhere in the country. When we build, we're building for sustainability. That's one of our main focuses, both environmental and the financial health of the properties. We bring creative solutions. I think POA is a group that no hurdle is too high, no barrier is not worth knocking down. So we do it in a creative way. We deliver value to all our stakeholders. We understand that our residents are very important to us, but so are our partners, folks in the town that we work with. It's very important that we're doing this as a team. I thought I'd take a step back and just talk about what affordable housing is, because everyone sort of is starting from a different starting point. So what we consider affordable is rent that is affordable when housing costs do not exceed 30% of someone's monthly income. So in Barnstable County, I'm going to be using the term AMI, which is a term that's used in the affordable housing world because it's how we peg our rents, and it's the average median income. So it's also a HUD term, and it's I'll be using the term AMI. So I apologize. It's just part of my vocabulary. So what in Barnstable County, what the AMI for a family of three, which is what we refer to as a 2-bedroom unit population, would be $97,900. And at 30% of someone's income at the AMI, they could afford a rent of $2,448. Well, that is a rent that for some is, of course, a huge burden. If you're a single person working a full-time minimum wage job, 30% of your income is $750. I think I don't have to tell most of you on this call, that's a rent that is really difficult to find on the Cape, especially if you're looking for a 2-bedroom unit, you have a child or a partner that you're supporting. At 80% AMI, which is another sort of target in the affordable housing world, it's also a number, 80% AMI, that CPA, Community Preservation Act funds sort of target. The rent there would be about $1,900. At 30% AMI, which is what we consider low income or very low income, your income is close to $30,000, and again, you're looking at about a 734 to be exact, payment for your, housing costs. And then, of course, to a SSI recipient, it's much deeper than that. It's, $282 dollars a month. So the other term that you hear sometimes is fair market rent, and that is a HUD term, and that refers to what they collectively think a 2-bedroom unit. They have fair market rent for every bedroom size, but in this case, fair market rent would be a little over $1,800 a month. So that's just to sort of set the stage so folks understand what some of the range of rent we're speaking about. So I on to the next slide. No. Here we go. So what's somewhat unique about Cape Cod, although there are other parts of the United States that have the same sort of setup, is the supply and the demand on the Cape is off, and it leads to really housing instability and housing cost burdens for folks who live full-time on the Cape. Maybe some of you folks have seen this chart. This is represents the supply that's coming onto the Cape in the past 10 years. So supply has waned. We're down to only about a little over 500 units last year. So the Cape is a supply constrained region, and some of that is environmental, some of that is permitting, some of that is the cost to build on the Cape. But it's pretty dramatic in these last few years, and that, of course, is never something that a growing town wants to see. And as a result, prices have just skyrocketed. I think the last 2 years, it's most dramatic. Well, I don't have to tell you, it's been most dramatic because of the pandemic. So the supply that's there is grabbing very, very high prices at every level of housing on the Cape. So again, this is something that really, what it amounts to is that 77% of renters with income less than $45,000 are cost burdened. So they are paying far in excess of 30% of their income in rent. So how do we switch that? How do we build our way out of this problem, right? I'll tell you right now, it's nearly impossible to build your way out of it, but we are doing our best to meet some of the imbalance of supply and demand, and keeping the diversity and the population on the Cape steady by doing development. And most of the development that is happening on the Cape, at least most of the development POA is doing, relies on a financial subsidy called the Low Income Housing Tax Credit. Big word, right? And what the Low Income Housing Tax Credit does is it allows private investment in affordable housing. The large majority of affordable housing throughout the nation relies on this subsidy, and it's a dollar for dollar reduction in the taxpayer's federal income tax. And in this case, the taxpayer is actually the investor into the housing that is built. The tax credits are allocated by the state. The state sets a priority through a QAP, a Qualified Allocation Plan. DHCD, the Department of Housing and in state, creates these priorities and creates the QAP. There are two types, and not to get too much into the weeds, but there are two types of credits of low-income housing tax credits. There's a 9%, which is a very, very competitive credit. It is what, as Brad mentioned earlier, it's what we've applied for the Wellfleet project that we're hoping to get underway sometime this year. And then there's a 4% credit, which is less competitive, still competitive, but it's a little less competitive. It is the credit we used at King's Landing and at Rock Harbor. So we acquired those properties using a 4% credit because it allowed us to move quickly through the acquisition and rehab process. Both of the credits are based on a qualified basis or qualified costs for the project and the acquisition. Again, these are equity sources are increasingly competitive because they're so relied upon for this kind of work. In Massachusetts, there is always at least one competition, one funding round, as we like to call it, for the 9% LIHTC. And this year there will potentially be two because there's such a backlog of projects in need of this. And then the 4% credit, it generates about $65,000 to $70,000 less per unit in equity. So it's a great tool. We've used it many, many times, but again, it just generates less equity per unit. So how do we do this? How do we assemble the resources and get a project underway? Well, this is just a very straightforward example of how we approach our work. So when we are assembling the sources, we develop a pro forma. So it's a budget for our operating the housing and managing the housing. What it amounts to is the rent coming in, the expenses. And what you land on is what I'm referring to here as NOI, which is net operating income. So from that net operating income, we are able to realize a loan, right? We're able to borrow money because we have income coming in, and that loan amount obviously depends very heavily on interest rates, on the term of the loan, and for a NOI of about $89,000, which to take a half a step back, what that means is, for a unit that we're charging about a little around $1,400 a month. We are, it costs us about $8,000 to manage, to pay taxes, to insure, to keep the project with the right set of staff. So what that amounts to is about $8,900 in NOI. And that yields a loan amount of about $122,000 a unit. Where the tax credit comes in is, a very important subsidy that can generate about $224,000 in equity, in LIHTC equity. And those are where we start. Those are the two sources because they're the largest of the sources that allow us to start assembling the resources to have a budget, a balanced budget, and build a property. So the uses, of course, are an acquisition, a site acquisition cost, construction, which has creeped over the years, but for the type of housing we're building, it's about $350,000. And that's a pretty conservative number, but that is a number that we rely upon to do our first flush of our finance. Soft costs, what's involved in the soft costs are financing fees, architecture fees, engineering fees, legal fees, that is, again, a number that we try to get very, try to keep it in check. But again, some of these costs are just increasingly elevated because of the work we do. And then, of course, there's reserves. Those are reserves that are required by the lenders or investors to make certain that the project is healthy and can pull down reserves when needed. If you have a bad year, if you have a lot of snow, if you have a storm event that requires additional capital into the property. And then the development fees. So those are fees earned for the development, ownership, and management of a property. So what that amounts to is a pretty sizable gap for an affordable housing. In this case, it's $115,000. In some cases, it's much higher than that. But this was just an example to sort of get us all thinking on the same set of facts. And as I mentioned, it's a growing financial gap. Construction costs, permanent costs, site costs, the timing to get a project prepared and ready for a groundbreaking. Design, redesign costs, as there are so many iterations to the work we do. We're trying to meet not just sustainability goals, but we're also trying to meet, have a project that meets the historic or the landscape of the properties we're building in, dealing with some of the abutters who might require, a tweak here or there on what we're proposing or what we're building. And then infrastructure costs. I don't have to tell folks here on the call just how fragile some of the infrastructure is on the Cape and how important it is that what we're building meets those needs and doesn't provide for additional burdens on some of the.
Hey, Julie,
Yes.
just really quickly, there looks like there's a question in the chat and I wanted to make sure we got to it. Elaine typed in the chat. Can taxpayers invest in a certain project? And what's the average investment?
Great, those are great questions. So typically it's not a direct taxpayer that's investing in these properties. Typically it's done through a syndicator, and it's banks and insurance companies, and we've had department stores invest in our projects. So a syndicator sort of assembles all of the businesses or firms, and in some cases it's a high wealth individual, maybe in part of the syndication, and that syndicator sort of builds a fund around affordable housing. And so the money isn't directly, in most cases, from one firm or one bank or one insurance company. It's usually a fund that buys the tax credits and then distributes the tax credits to the folks participating in the fund. The investment, the level of investment, it differs. And what it is directly related to, as I mentioned before, is the qualified costs. So obviously, a 40 unit property has a bigger tax credit equity than would a smaller property. So I'll get to some sources and uses in real numbers in a minute, and I think that'll help sort of answer some of the other questions. Did I get them all?
Yeah, that's what we got. Thanks,
Perfect.
Julie.
Okay, great. So as I mentioned, the gap is growing. I think you've probably all heard this, right? That because of the uses, right? Some of the costs to build, to permit, to design are getting expensive. We have found sort of greater challenges on the Cape. Again, we don't mind challenges. We've got to come up with creative solutions, but they are greater on the Cape. You know, the construction costs are higher. We're seeing that from Bourne to Wellfleet. There are folks that just recognize that getting onto the Cape and doing their work in the Cape is you know, it's going to be more expensive. The permitting costs, you know, we recognize just how important the environment is for folks who are living on the Cape, and we don't want to be the ones to disturb that, right? So when we permit, we take a very, very high level of design work to make sure that we've got the right stormwater management plan. We are, you know, in some cases, designing a very, very high level of septic systems. So we're not, we're not influencing the environment around us. Timing, you know, I talked about this 9% credit and the application process. You know, sometimes it's 2-3 years before we get the right resources to build a property. And so, you know, we're carrying a cost, that burden as a developer, because it's important that we get the work done. Infrastructure is incredibly costly. You know, thankfully, there is a subsidy that we've used, and I'll get to that in a minute, on some of our properties, but it's a cost that the project has to bear. And then, you know, we've all heard it, right? The interest rate increase. When we, you know, when we looked at building a property even 2 or 3 years ago, the interest rate environment was so different. We could borrow a whole lot more and still be on financially sound footing, right? We just were able to lock in a much lower rate. Inflation, again, that has a huge impact on our operating budgets, and we have to be mindful and recognize that inflation is here, at least in the short term, to stay. And again, we build being very, very mindful of keeping the property affordable and stable, and all of this, you know, are something that we constantly struggle with. So there are ways, obviously, of filling the financing gap, and this is sort of where the creative part of our work comes in, right? We can fill it through finance, right? For the finance, through grants, through, you know, we're a nonprofit, so we have access to a whole nother side of the world in grants, and we are very, very at POA as a organization. We look under every rock. We try to find grants that allow us to do our work even that much better. And we have, you know, very good track record of bringing grants in to meet program needs. Town and state soft funding. So we're applying to the state for some soft funding to make sure that we get the subsidies we need to build it. And at the town level, of course, you have CPA funds, you have affordable housing trust funds, you have other Airbnb funds. Those are critically important to filling the gap. POA does a lot of energy work. So we get solar credits, we get energy credits and rebates that, again, they help us to build the right project, and they help fill a gap. They help us do the right thing. Real estate tax abatements, you know, we look for those where we can. You know, when we build a property, it's an expensive property, right? Solved by the construction costs, but what we try to get towns to understand is our rent is restricted. We are restricting our rent. We are deed restricting our rent. And so we ask that they look at that when they assess property values. And then, of course, probably the most important part of our work on the Cape is town-owned land, and being able to get the town-owned land either at a very, very, very low cost. And that, you know, as I showed in my previous slide, that's, you know, can be upwards of $25,000 per year. And we applaud the folks on the Cape and all the towns who have made a goal of finding town-owned land that can be used specifically for affordable housing. It's a very, very important part of our work on the Cape. We can also design to sort of lessen the gap, right? We can, and most of that comes in increased density. It's not something we do typically on the Cape. The Cape has, you know, other reasons for not, you know, building the highest and you know, most dense community. There are limits imposed by Title V when we use Title V septic. You know, the number of bedrooms, so it does limit our the number of units we can create. And of course, you know, what's most important to our work is preserving green space, making sure that we're not imposing long-standing and irreversible things onto the landscape down there. So this is part of how we get creative and part of how we fill the financing gaps in our. So here's a financing example, and I'm sorry for all the numbers. I just wanted folks to get a better sense of how we build our pro forma, how we finance our properties, and what are some of the levers, right, that we can use to get to a project that we can feel happy and support building to the level of affordability that we think is important. So as I mentioned before, there's 9% credits, there's 4% credits, and then the final column is a workforce approach to a project. And the 9% and the 4%, you know, specifically target the low-income housing tax credit program ranges. So for a 9%, at least in Massachusetts, it's really a 30% AMI and a 60% AMI. Those are the targets of the program. For 4%, because of this new, it's called average income, we can go sometimes to an 80% AMI, but for every 80% AMI unit, we have to have a 30% AMI unit. So the balance is a 60% AMI population. And then in workforce, the workforce range can differ from region to region, town to town. How we define workforce is outside of a LIHTC, and just so you know, I hate the term workforce, but it's ever present and it's a term I can't get away from. Because folks in our properties, in our LIHTC properties, work. The large majority of our LIHTC, our low-income housing tax credit properties work. But workforce is a term to just describe outside of the LIHTC world. It targets you know, a missing middle. I don't mind that term as much. It targets folks who have incomes in the ranges of 80% to 110% AMI. And again, that higher register really depends on where you're building. I think on the Cape, we focus our missing middle to the income ranges between 80 and 110% AMI. So each one of these has a different set of sources. And there's a little bit of a tweak to the uses, right? And I can get to those in just a minute. But the sources for a 9% deal, as I mentioned before, it's a first mortgage debt, it's the LIHTC equity. Those are the two larger of the sources. And then of course there's CPA, Community Preservation Act sub-debt. On the Cape, we're very fortunate to have the Barnstable County Home Consortium. Again, they invest in our properties. They have a cap of about $300,000 for a project. And I should mention, this example is for a 42 unit project. And then there are, yes,
Just two questions. This is going great. I just want to make sure we got to the questions. I think they are related to the chart you have there. One is from Carolyn, and she's asking, is the 9% or 4% credit allocation impacted by other interest rate volatility?
that's a great question. So not precisely direct, right? It does have an impact, but it's not the same as like the mortgage, right? What has a greater impact on the LIHTC equity is the price per credit, right? So folks buy those credits, and when they buy those credits, that's the equity we bring to the project. So in times of low earnings, so if there are banks or insurance companies, or the retail sector who have less profits to shield, so less profits to apply that tax credit to, it can affect the tax credit pricing. We've been very fortunate in Massachusetts that there are numerous organizations and firms that the tax credit pricing has remained fairly steady. And POA as an organization has really been able to keep it at about 95 cents per credit. So if that credit was lower, it would produce, you would be bringing less equity to the property. But it's been hovering around 95% for POA in many different cycles, many different financial cycles. So we've been very fortunate in that way. The reason why the 9% and the 4% are different in this chart is, again, because the 9% is worth more than the 4%. What's again very, very positive about building on the Cape is that the Cape is a DDA, a difficult to develop area. That is a label that was given to it by the state, and that allows that 4% credit to be increased by about 30%. So in this particular case, because I did this example, if I were building on the Cape, that 4% credit almost gets to the 9% credit. But if you didn't have the DDA, the difficult to develop area, it would be worth less. So again, when we go into the state for this 9% credit, we also ask for other state funding sources. So in this case, in this example, we would have asked for about the same level of state funding resources. And the state, obviously.
Julie,
Yep.
there's 4 other questions that came in the chat
Great.
around some of this stuff, so I think this is really good. And the next question is from Christine. It's related to what you had just said. The project can also tap into all of the federal/state tax credits for solar, HVAC, etc. It's a question mark.
Yes, they can. And that's a great comment. And I did not build this into the model, into this particular model, but POA does a lot of work in that environment. And sometimes to use those credits, right, you have to spend a little more, your construction costs might go up. It's definitely not offset. We definitely see a lot of value in the solar tax credits, in the rebates, in all this other money, or this infrastructure money that's coming into our projects. I didn't show it here, but yes, those are critically important to our work, and we have tapped into those on many, many of our projects moving forward.
Thank you, Julie. And then there is a few other questions in the chat. And if you want to wait to get to them, or if you want to address them now, I think some of them are relevant more to this slide. I'm going to, Betty put, I'm going to ask her what determines whether or not they replied to RSVP to develop a property.
So an RFP, a request for proposal. I think that's what she's getting at. Um, when we read through an RFP, we're very aware of the fact that there are others that do work as maybe not as perfectly as we do, but certainly do incredible work in this field. So we are not the only developer that is able to bring affordable housing into the state and into your town. But when we look at the landscape of RFPs, we have to be mindful of the fact that we have obligations to the work we already have in our pipeline, we're already working on, and aware of the fact that the state sort of limits how many projects you can put into any specific funding round, right? So even though we might have the staff to move the project through the permitting, through the architecture, through the assembling of the resources, because we are restricted to only one project per funding round, we feel it is best sometimes to not respond to an RFP, because we know we wouldn't be able to put that project into the funding round for maybe another year or two. And so we just take that very seriously, POA does. And so we don't respond to every RFP, but we read them all. We absolutely read them all. And if there's a partner we can go in with, CDP is an example of that. And we're able to get comfortable that partner could submit rather than POA. We use that tool as well. I hope that answered the question.
Yes, thank you, Julie. A couple other questions, and if you want, we can either wait till the end, or if you want to get to them now, that's up to you.
If they don't pertain to the slide, I certainly can pick that up.
Got it. I think some of them do.
Okay.
So Carolyn's asking, do you know of any Cape projects that use private tax exempt bonds?
I think tax exempt bonds. So I don't. I will spend a few minutes on that, because again, there's some information around that I think folks on the call might be interested in. So
Yeah.
As a nonprofit, right, we can raise money through tax exempt bond issuance, right? So we can raise money on our own that is a little more flexible, and we can sort of choose the buckets or the projects, where we think that money is best spent. It's an obligation of POA. Typically, we do paper it so that, it's a mortgage for a project. I don't know any on the Cape that do that. POA has done a bond issuance. More recently, we did one. We are not using it as the sole source for projects. We are using it primarily to buy properties that may need to wait a few years to go into the tax credit cycle. And so we've got to sort of buy those properties to preserve them in the short term and look to put them into the LIHTC program long term. So we've also used some of that money to plug financing gaps, right? And recognize that as an affordable housing developer, building the housing, getting the housing into the market as an option for low-income folks is our main goal. So we're able to sort of use some of those funds to plug financing gaps. So I don't know of any, but it's a little more common, like in California, where the need is so great and the speed of execution has to be done pretty consistently. But I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, thank you, Julie. There's just one more related to this slide, I think, and I think the other ones can be asked at the end, so we'll keep those. The one is from Gary here that says, can you explain the private equity line?
Sure, definitely. So we hear a lot about folks saying, we want workforce housing, And again, everyone labels different types of housing as workforce housing. In the workforce housing world, primarily, they don't rely on low-income housing tax credits, right? They can't, because they're out of the range of that program. The AMIs they're targeting are out of the range of that program. So there are some resources, in Massachusetts. The first one is what's called the Mass Housing Workforce Fund. And Mass Housing has taken, has built this fund around specifically targeting workforce units. And it's a source we've used on some of our projects. We used it at one of our projects in Bourne. It's part of Canal Bluffs. And what they specifically do is they say, we're going to target and make sure this workforce housing is income restricted. So most workforce housing, if it's not subsidized, i.e. by Mass Housing or by another source, or it has the ability to raise rents or not target a specific segment of the AMI or the population. Mass Housing is, what Mass Housing is doing is it's buying down some otherwise market rate housing with this subsidy. So in that column, my workforce housing column, you see, I've put that in there because it's a great resource and it's something, as I said before, we have used. The private equity line is, is for folks who are building in this environment. They recognize that they are expecting, enough profit in their operating of this type of housing to attract private equity. So, even some of the firms that you might be familiar with, Penrose, they would put their own equity into a deal, generate a return, and satisfy the returns for that private equity. There's many ways private equity comes into a deal, hundreds of thousands of ways. But that private equity is typically looking for a return of about 15% while the property is operating. And really, they're looking for the return primarily when the property is sold. So it's difficult to compete with that kind of equity as POA, because we won't sell our property, right? We're in it for the long term. Most private equity that is coming into a deal and coming into a multifamily housing, as I said, they're looking for about a 15% return, cash on cash while the property is being operated. But overall, it's higher teens because they're relying on the increased value in 5 to 7 years is really the range, typically for that private equity. So part of the funds that POA, part of our bond funds, is really to sort of find a way to bring in our own equity. It's POA's bond issuance to fill that gap, and still recognize that we're going to keep the property, we're going to maintain the property as little a affordable. So I hope that answered your question. Workforce housing is hard to build. I will tell you that. It's called the missing middle for a reason. It's really difficult to find the right private equity to make a deal pencil out and maintain a level of rent that is still, small A affordable. But, it's something that we're challenged with all the time, POA. Folks want to see, the little A affordable housing. And it's something, we recognize the importance of, and try to do our best to meet those needs. What I will point out in the workforce column is that some workforce housing properties that we know of are asking for CPA funds. And as long as there is a portion of those funds, a portion of those units that will be 80% AMI, that will be restricted at 80% AMI, those funds can be used for that property. It just has to be papered appropriately. And really it requires a much heavier lift than might a 9% or 4% property. So on the bottom, you see my CPA leverage line. Again, this is all, this is just one example, right? If I were to be building a 42 unit property and I was, lucky enough to get a 9% award, I could leverage those CPA funds, meaning I can bring other sources to that project at an 11-to-1 ratio. So for every $1 of CPA funds, I'm bringing to the project $11 of other funds. It gets a little harder to meet that heavy leverage on a 4% deal, directly because the low income housing tax credit equity is lower. I can't generate as much equity using a 4% as I could a 9. And then of course on the workforce, as I said, that private equity number I have on there it's there because that is what the project can generate as far as a required return on that equity. So if that private equity wasn't a market private equity and it was, someone who said, what, I believe in this missing middle. I'm not looking for a 15% return. I'm looking for an 8% return. You might have less CPA dollars needed for that project, and that leverage could be better. So do folks understand in my very condensed version of what leverage is and some of the sources that are coming into these deals? Do I have any questions?
Hi, Julie, this is Andrea. I'm going to jump in because I'm hearing from a couple folks, including Brad, that people are starting to lose internet out here.
Okay.
So I'm going to help moderate questions. There aren't any new questions, but if anyone wants to raise their hand or pop in the chat, I will flag it for Julie. The rest of the questions I think can wait until the end we have so far.
Okay. I have just one more slide, and this is really just some examples of the 5 financing sources and the CPA leverage on some more recent deals. So Melpit Farm and Brewster Woods were POA deals. We were able to, on both those deals, highly leverage the CPA funds. Again, it was at a point in time where we had a very low interest rate environment. So we were able to really bring mortgage proceeds into both of those projects at a higher level than we can today. And we also use a lot of energy credits and energy grants to produce very, very sustainable, near net zero and passive house for Brewster Woods. And those funds really came in at a time when we could use them very efficiently. So our CPA leverage, we're pretty good on both those properties. Sort of a perfect storm for us on both of those. Nauset Green is a project in Eastham. Some of this is kind of an estimate. I was able to sort of get the bulk of the information to make this assessment here. Again, they used other sources as well. They used Affordable Housing Trust, that's a DHCD home, DHCD other, which is sort of the bucket for all those other programs that are so critically important to our work. At Brewster Woods, the other really important subsidy was MassWorks. So that was a subsidy that was actually managed at the town level, but it was managed for, infrastructure work for Brewster Woods. And it's something, the Cloverleaf project that is, underway, also required many of these resources, and again, produced a really great leverage of the CPA funds. So I'll stop there. I don't know if anyone has questions on that particular slide, or if we want to open it up to others.
Let's see, I'm not seeing new questions, so let me just kind of catch up on some of the questions we didn't get to from before. Someone asked about CPA, being able to use CPA above 80% AMI. Do you want to say how towns have been using it recently?
Yeah, some towns have been using it, according to the statute. You can go up to 100% AMI. Others have sort of restricted it to 80% AMI. And there's a long sort of detailed history in that, but I think it's sometimes can be very town specific, especially if those funds, if the CPA funds coming into an affordable housing trust, which is how some of those CPA funds are managed and administered. That answer.
I think so. If Larry, if you have another part of that question, you can let us all know. And then here's an interesting question. How do we help increase funding rounds? Should we do any advocacy at the state level?
I think advocacy at every level is critically important for this work. We have, I don't think I have to tell you, but we have a really great DHCD, are really great partners, and they love to hear from folks. I work in other states where they are literally the allocating agency and the housing agency are a silo. They don't want to hear from outsiders. They don't want the pressure. They don't want to hear about your problems. DHCD is completely different. So, invite folks down. We do it at every groundbreaking, at every ribbon cutting. We invite, folks, stakeholders, political folks, to see and feel and witness the importance of this work. We always try to find someone who either is newly moved in or someone with, who has a housing story to tell and have them speak at some of our events, because really those voices too need to be heard and need to be elevated.
Julie, what role can the town's short-term rental tax funds play in a project? And do those funds have any income restrictions on the units that they support?
So, again, I think it's town by town. I think short-term rental tax revenue is so important to our work, and so in such a meaningful way to use those funds for something that will be an asset the town can rely on for years to come. So I can only imagine the headaches some of the Airbnb or the short-term units bring to all of your towns, but let's flip it on its head, right? Let's use those for something that can be an asset for the town, that can help folks stay in their towns, in the towns they grew up in and the towns they love. So that would be my answer there.
Thanks. And Jillian chimed in that, of course, it depends on the way that the town allocates those funds. And so if they're allocated as a funding stream into your trust, then you can use them for housing as opposed to other uses, which we, of course, advocate for. Betty, I see your hand. Betty has a question.
I mean, what I was trying to get at about how you decide what projects you take was, obviously, you can only take so many. But if you have, obviously, we have a lot of people who need money. You have to make decisions between what you're gonna, what you're gonna take and what you're not, or what you're gonna apply to the RFP on. That was sort of it, more than just whether, you had 3 and you only do 3 every.
Yeah.
But if there are other criteria,
Gotcha.
literally,
Yeah.
we've got the Walsh property coming, we're gonna have a lot of RFPs, and we also just trying to figure out about what would make developers interested in the project.
That's a great question. I should have thought that that's what you were asking. I will tell you, I'm on the Affordable Housing Trust here in my town. I live in Milton. And we are trying to pull together an RFP for a site we have here in Milton. And there's a few things that I always talk about when we're talking about RFPs. I think first and foremost, a really well thought out RFP, right? I've read RFPs where they're like, well, we don't have sewer, we don't have water, we don't have this, but you guys can figure that out, right? Well, no, we can't. We've got many other opportunities where some of that has been figured out for us, or at least they've laid a groundwork, right? And be very specific. I know you don't want to clamor down on creativity, and you want proposals that envision things on a level that maybe you never even thought about. But if you have an income level you're targeting, be specific. If you want family housing, if you want elderly housing, if you want walking paths, if you want passive, active recreation, the more specific you can be, it really helps us think, wow, this town has thought about this. This town knows what they want. We're not going to have trouble, again, with those costs of designing, redesigning, meeting, and then lastly, and this has been a struggle here in Milton, talk to the abutters. I mean, I think at Wellfleet, that's a great example of how Wellfleet went out and said, look, we want to hear from you. We'll do a listening session. We know what we're going to hear isn't, going to be, in 100% support of the project, but we want to hear from you because we want to make sure that the developer, the chosen developer, recognizes that we've done some of this footwork, right? Because, I think we've got a great network on the Cape, POA does, but other, other developers coming in that, again, do great work, they may be they might hesitate because they think, well, we don't have the know-how on the Cape to be able to be abutters, right? And we say this all the time at POA, we don't want to be a landlord, we want to be a neighbor, right? We want to make sure that what we're doing makes not just our residents happy, but it is a community asset that you don't drive past and, shield your view of vision.
Thank you.
Julie, to follow up on that, one of the messages that we've heard over the years throughout the Lower Cape Housing Institute programming is that developers want to work in communities that are supportive of housing and supportive of the project. How do you gauge community support, both at the town level and just as the residents in general? How do you measure that?
That's a great question. And sometimes it is really knowing a lot of you, right? And recognizing that all of you want this work to happen, but it doesn't happen overnight, right? And so putting the work in with, not again, the abutters and even the town planners and the building department and the fire chief and the police officers, really getting a sense of what is needed, to making sure you're building what is needed and you're not building for building's sake, right? Another thing I will say, and we do this quite often soon as a, as soon as a RFP comes across our desk, we look to see the work that the Affordable Housing Trust is doing, or the CPA is doing. You know, in some towns, the CPA is focused on open space and historic preservation. Great, that's great. That's important to a lot of towns, right? We have to see that there's an active, involved CPA or Affordable Housing Trust. And they're going to be our partners, and they're gonna tell us, you know, what road to walk down, and really be an important part of that work. If that doesn't exist, and you know, not every town I recognize has an Affordable Housing Trust, but some towns have CPA and have a very active CPA focus on affordable housing. So that's pretty critical for us. Again, you know, we can sort of pick and choose where we want to work. I think, you know, unfortunately, you know, PO is full of these type A's. And so they want to be effective. They want to move the project quickly. They want to, you know, do all the right things. And sometimes if you've got folks in the town that say, yeah, we know about this SHI and we realize 10% has to be part of our world, but you know, we're not going to give you the support that you really truly.
Thank you. Some more questions are coming through. Why are housing production plans important?
Again, it's because a housing production plan, and you know, I worked on our one here in Milton. The needs, you know, those housing production plans, I'll start there. The housing production plans shouldn't be a scripted production plan, right? There should be work that goes into that. It should recognize the needs of the town. It should be a roadmap for a developer coming in, saying, okay, they need family housing. They need housing at 60% AMI. They need workforce housing. It should be a plan that helps a developer like POA and many others say, okay, this is in writing. This is what the town needs. And you know, I know, you know, it happened here in Milton. Oh, we got to get it done. We got to get it done. It's, you know, it's part of our obligation. Well, it's such an important document. So I hope folks get involved at it and with that in mind.
And would you also agree that a housing production plan that's developed with all of the right participation of committees within the town should demonstrate alignment in the town around their production strategies?
Absolutely. You know, without question. I mean, I think what sometimes folks don't recognize is that building support means that you're going to end up with the right community asset. You're going to end up building this, you know, the right things. If you don't have all the stakeholders at the table, there's always going to be you know, folks who, oh, why was that built? And why didn't we focus on this? Well, clearly you need to get an alignment so that what is built meets the needs.
All right, we're getting some more questions here. Is there a minimum number of units that makes a project attractive? Not just feasible, but attractive.
So that's a great question. I think for POA, feasible and attractive go a little bit more hand in hand. And the reason why is because to keep it attractive, you've got to be able to finance it and keep it feasible, right? So in our world on the Cape, you know, because we have so many other properties nearby, so we own about a little over 550 units of housing on the Cape. And we're actively working on, you know, another 100 or so. So we can feel comfortable that a project that might be 25 to 40 units is the right size for us on the Cape. Now, that's not the right size for us in an area of the country where we don't have boots on the ground, right? But, you know, we have 24-hour maintenance folks involved in our work because that is critical to, you know, keeping residents happy, keeping communities happy, and maintaining stability in our communities. So, I think financially feasible. What happens on some of these smaller projects is you can't afford to have a budget that has a full-time property manager or manager maintenance person there to effectively manage that property and meet the needs of the residents. So we tend not to build projects of, you know, smaller than maybe 25 units on the Cape. But again, they can be attractive. They can be done, you know, very, very well. And, you know, multi-family housing, take all shapes and sizes. And I think wherever you have land, wherever you have free land, especially, you should be thinking about what can fit there. What density makes sense there, given all the other constraints of the property.
You know, as you were talking, I was wondering if maybe Carolyn meant attractive in terms of piquing a developer's interest in responding. Would you answer differently?
I would answer a little differently, and I would say that it's probably for folks just coming down to the Cape or just considering working on the Cape, it's probably 35 to 40.
Can you talk about an RFP for design build as opposed to an RFP for design services first? Not sure if I understand that. Does that make sense to you?
So we're seeing this a little bit more. So a design build primarily targets folks who are slightly run their organization slightly differently than we do. So POA hires a general contractor, and that general contractor, you know, builds the project. There are some local developers who develop and build and own and manage, you know, again, the property. So that developer also takes part in the building. And there are some efficiencies, I will say, in smaller projects especially, where that developer is also able to make a profit on the build. So in some ways, they're able to maybe see less developer fee because their work is also incorporating a builder fee, a builder profit. And those, you know, we see those, as I said, sometimes in smaller, you know, smaller builds, you know, 12 units or less. And it's, you know, if you have the right builder developer, especially one that truly does the work, you know, truly recognizes that his reputation is, you know, it's important that it's built and developed with the same mindset. So there are some really great builder developers out there. We've run into a few that just do this work in such a meaningful way that I wouldn't shy away from those if folks are thinking about them.
Another question. So does separating the design from the construction trigger the project to become a municipal building project and having to comply with Davis-Bacon?
Oh boy, now we're going down a rabbit hole. So I think first and foremost, what the noise we're hearing a little bit, I shouldn't say noise, but the pushback we're hearing a little bit about some of the work we're doing, right, is if the town gets too prescriptive, right? If the town says we want it to be, you know, 4-unit building, and we want it to look like this, and we want it to be this and this and this, then what folks are saying is that builder or developer or that is just a vehicle for the town, right? That that it's too prescriptive, and so it should be public bidding, right? You know, you kind of understand that in some ways, right? We, you know, when we have it, when we have it designed and built and developed by 3 separate entities, it feels a little less like it's a prescriptive set of work that that could trigger Davis-Bacon, or could trigger you know, public bidding.
Shay, do you have a follow-up?
Thanks, Julie. This has really been incredible. And even though I've been, working with you on the Lawrence Road project, I have learned so much in the last hour plus. Just kind of one observation, I think one of the challenges you talked about is just construction costs here. And, when most of the larger affordable housing developers, partner up with a construction company of the magnitude that can do a, 40, 50, 60 unit project. And hiring the subs is really difficult because they tend to end up having to bring them from off Cape. And I think one of the challenges that we face is still at the end of the day that are the companies here on the Cape who do construction and build, housing, have so much better margins building McMansions, if you will, than they ever will building a multifamily house. I mean, you can be looking at budgets where it's not trying to squeeze $400 a square foot to build, but you've got somebody with deep pockets who's happy to be spending $700 to $1,000 a square foot, and you get to make more money off of that project. And so I think that's one of the reasons why when folks say, why can't we get local builders, or why, or POA, why don't you hire Cape Associates or to do, to build this project? It's just that, they're really busy and can just make a lot more money than what you're able to do on a really tight budget.
No, that's true. Some of the work we try to do to entice subcontractors, we make our general contractors really look local. We want to hire local folks. I mean, that is critically important to us into our work, and we want to keep that that income, there on the Cape. One of the things we try to specifically make our general contractors understand is that, for good or bad, I think it's for good. This work is very, there's a lot of people overseeing this work. So the response to the subcontractors is very positive. It's about getting them paid on time, getting the work done on a schedule, building, in the case of the passive house, it's building the local understanding and experience and knowledge on some of these, on some of these technologies. And so, we do all we can in our scope to say, okay, we'll bring our head of design down there and host don't be afraid of passive house. So we can get some of the subs there to say, this isn't really much different than what I do, because I am a skilled laborer and all of these things are important. So I do them even if they're not on the drawings. I do ceiling, I do, I make sure I've ear sealing done right. I put insulation behind the walls here and there because I recognize, as a person who lives and works on the Cape, the importance of the environment and energy efficiency. So you have great subcontractors who do this work in a very thoughtful way, and we want those up. We want those subs up on our projects, and we don't want them to be afraid of, I have to report up to the general contractor. Or, we want them to feel part of the work.
Julie, I have a question for you.
Sure.
It seems like the audience questions are dying down. We're ready to wrap up soon. So sort of on that note, we have about 30 elected officials or town officials and town staff. Given the high cost that you've been describing and the funding gaps and projects that we're seeing in the region, what's the number one thing that you want towns to take away from your presentation when it relates to resources and money?
I want towns to be a part of the process. And, it's sometimes what that means is you're involved early on so that the permitting is, is less confrontational and cost less, right? Every time I bring an attorney down there for a 40B permit, that costs the project money, right? I'm not, we will do all we can to make sure everyone in that process is heard and understood, and we're meeting the needs of the participants. But, time is money, and we would rather put a better shingle on our property than have to spend it, I know there's probably some attorneys on the call, but we would, some of those, even those little things are important and are, in our minds allow us to do our work even better. Setting aside resources, obviously dollars are still critically important. And you can't come as a town with a list of, we want all these things and not know that all those things cost money. We want to deliver, like, that's what every developer, in our world wants to do. But there are things that come at a cost, and we're going to work with you to leverage those costs. We're going to find grants or other resources to bring to the table. But, it's unfortunately, I hate to use this term, but you have to put your money where your mouth is. And I want you to trust us that we're using the resources appropriately. I don't want you to write a blank check. That's not what we're here to do. But there's a need for a lot of support around this work.
Awesome. Thank you, Julie. Looks like we have one more question before I close it out. Gary is asking, is POA or other large developers doing anything with mixed use projects, combining ownership with rental units?
Great question. POA has been combining ownership with rental units, less so in Massachusetts, but more so in Chicago. It's difficult. Affordable home ownership is not for the faint at heart. We are very good at what we do. We would like to get there on home ownership. It's a different world, and some of it is very, very much finance driven, right? Even if you're hoping to break even, right, which is really our hope on most of our home ownership work in Chicago. Even if you're hoping to break even, there's risk to it. And the subsidies are just not there. The flexibility of the subsidies just really aren't there. But we're never going to give up, because we believe that home ownership is, an important part of, leveling up the field. I mean, it's important that people, invest in their communities, and part of that is investing in their homes. So we do mixed use, we do, when it calls for, have, ground level retail, or do a little bit of, office or commercial work. Not so much on the Cape. Most of our work there is purely residential, but we would love to figure out a way to do some ownership on the Cape, and we think it's right for that.
Wonderful. We do have another question in the chat. I do want to wrap up and make sure that people are getting to where they need to go at 11:30. So Jillian, if it's okay with you, we can certainly follow up with you on that question. And if it's a question you can answer really quickly, Julie. I don't-
Sure. We are constantly trying to play a role in getting people informed and educated about affordable housing and how a private person or a private individual can donate their land. I do it a lot more sort of as my work in the Affordable Housing Trust, but you know, I think meeting developers such as POA and some of the others who do this work in such an important way is helpful. Having a call with me, I can be very I can be very convincing when I need to be. And we would love to see more of that. And absolutely, especially in these higher in these communities where you know, some folks just buy land just to assemble it, right? If they've got a parcel that they would like to see or get some affordable work done, we'd love to talk to them about it.
Great. Thank you, Julie. Thank you, everyone. This has been such a pleasure, Julie. I think just the discussion and the questions that have come in have been so robust, and I think everybody's very happy to have been a part of this. So thank you again, everybody. We will be following up with an email as we do after all these sessions that will include a survey link to the session, as well as upcoming ways to sort of register for other upcoming programs. This is our last Lower Cape Housing Institute program of the fiscal year, but we certainly want to hear your ideas and thoughts for things to come up for next fiscal year. We always appreciate that. That's how we learned of this session today. So thank you again. We'll be in touch soon, and we'll follow up with an email. Have a good day, everybody, and stay safe. Bye.
Thank you, Julie.
Thank you.